The Qorthak Dominion possessed the remarkable distinction of being simultaneously the most advanced archaeological civilization in the galaxy and the most spectacularly incompetent at actually understanding what they discovered. Their scientists could carbon date a rock from 3 star systems away, map the quantum signature of a fossilized sneeze, and determine the exact emotional state of whoever had last touched an artifact, but ask them to figure out what the thing actually did, and they'd spend the next century arguing about font choices for their research papers. It was during Earth's Renaissance period, while humans were busy rediscovering that the planet wasn't flat and that maybe washing your hands occasionally might prevent plague, that a Qorthak archaeological survey team stumbled upon what would later be catalogued as Discovery Item QD 7749XX. The artifact sat in a small cave system in what would eventually become Switzerland, humming with enough energy to power a small city and radiating quantum signatures that should have made every scanner in the vicinity file a formal complaint. Dr. Qorthak, the expedition leader whose academic credentials were exceeded only by his ability to miss the blindingly obvious, examined the crystalline object with the kind of thorough incompetence that had made him famous throughout the Dominion. The artifact was roughly spherical, constructed from what appeared to be compressed starlight held together by mathematical equations, and possessed an energy signature that registered as probably important on their most sensitive equipment. "Fascinating," declared Dr. Qorthak, adjusting his sensory apparatus with the confidence of someone who had never been right about anything. "Clearly a primitive ornamental object. Note the crude crystalline structure and the complete absence of any recognizable technology. These early humans were quite skilled at making shiny baubles, though obviously they had no understanding of actual science." The artifact was duly catalogued, photographed from 17 different angles, subjected to every non-invasive test known to Qorthak science, and then filed away in the primitive human curiosities section of their vast archaeological database. The fact that it had been generating enough exotic energy to bend space-time was noted in footnote 247b of the preliminary report, right between observations about the cave's humidity levels and a lengthy discussion of proper equipment maintenance protocols. For the next 4 centuries, the artifact made its way through the galaxy's most prestigious academic institutions, like a particularly stubborn case of intellectual food poisoning. Each facility that examined it came to the same conclusion: obviously human, obviously primitive, obviously decorative. The Zenthari Empire's War College spent 3 years trying to determine if it was a weapon, concluding that humans were too unsophisticated to create anything genuinely dangerous. The Nexarian Republic's Diplomatic Academy used it as a teaching aid to demonstrate the cultural limitations of pre-spaceflight civilizations. The artifact's journey through academia was a masterclass in confirmation bias wrapped in a comfortable blanket of species-based prejudice. Every test confirmed what the researchers already knew: humans were a young species with limited technological capabilities, and anything they created must therefore be simple, primitive, and ultimately unimportant. The energy readings were dismissed as residual quantum fluctuations from improper storage. The complex internal structure was labeled accidental crystallization patterns, and the fact that it seemed to respond to certain types of brain waves was filed under coincidental electromagnetic interference. Eventually, the artifact found its way to the Meridian Institute of Xenological Studies on planet Xenthos Prime, where it was installed in the primitive species hall with all the fanfare typically reserved for a particularly uninspiring doorstop. The hall was designed to showcase the charming limitations of various pre-spaceflight cultures, with Earth occupying a prominent position between the violent ritual implements of Rigel 7 and the inexplicably shiny objects from the Andromeda Fringe. Dr. Qorthak, the museum's chief curator, regarded the artifact with the kind of weary resignation typically reserved for persistent relatives or tax assessments. In his 200 years of managing the collection, he had fielded approximately 18,000 questions about the mysterious human device, and his standard response had evolved into a work of art in diplomatic dismissal. "The artifact represents a fascinating example of pre-technological craftsmanship," he would explain to visitors, his voice carrying the practiced boredom of someone who had given this speech entirely too many times. "While primitive by our standards, it demonstrates the human species' early attempts to create aesthetically pleasing objects. The crystalline structure suggests they may have had some rudimentary understanding of mineral composition, though of course they lacked the scientific framework to create anything genuinely functional." The primitive species hall had become something of a tourist attraction, drawing visitors from across the galaxy who came to marvel at the quaint limitations of younger civilizations. Diplomats would bring their offspring to demonstrate the importance of proper education. Military officers would study the displays to understand the tactical thinking of potential allies. Scientists would examine the artifacts to gain insights into the evolutionary development of intelligence. None of them, it should be noted, bothered to actually touch anything. The Qorthak approach to archaeology was built on the fundamental principle that observation was superior to interaction. Their equipment could analyze molecular structures from a distance, map quantum fields without direct contact, and determine the complete history of an object through sophisticated scanning techniques. The idea of actually handling artifacts was considered primitive, unsanitary, and potentially dangerous to both the researcher and the specimen. This philosophy worked remarkably well for most of their discoveries. Ancient weapons remained safely inert, cultural artifacts retained their structural integrity, and researchers avoided the kinds of embarrassing incidents that had plagued earlier archaeological efforts. The system had one small flaw. It was completely useless for understanding technology designed to be activated by direct neural contact. The artifact waited with the patience of something that had been designed to wait. Its creators, the ethereal collective, had been extinct for approximately 50,000 years, but their technology had been built to last. They had understood something about the nature of consciousness that most current galactic civilizations had missed entirely. Intelligence wasn't about processing speed or memory capacity, but about the ability to perceive reality through multiple dimensional frameworks simultaneously. The ethereal collective had been what most species would consider disabled. They had evolved beyond traditional sensory organs, experiencing the universe through direct neural interface with quantum fields. Their technology was designed not for beings who saw light or heard sound, but for minds that could perceive the fundamental information structures underlying reality itself. They had scattered 12 consciousness keys across the galaxy, each designed to activate only when touched by a mind that processed information through non-traditional channels. The keys were tests, waiting for species that had developed beyond conventional sensory limitations. The irony, of course, was that the very characteristics most galactic civilizations considered evolutionary limitations were exactly what the keys were designed to recognize. It was into this carefully constructed system of academic incompetence that Kira Nightshade arrived, armed with a student visa, a sarcastic sense of humor, and the kind of determined optimism that comes from spending 18 years proving that other people's assumptions are usually wrong. Kira was part of the Meridian Institute's Cultural Integration Initiative, a program designed to give promising students from younger civilizations exposure to advanced galactic society. In theory, it was meant to accelerate human development by providing access to superior educational resources. In practice, it was a way for established species to demonstrate their enlightened tolerance while reinforcing their own sense of superiority. The program's coordinators had been initially hesitant to accept a blind human student, concerned about the practical difficulties of accommodating someone with sensory limitations in their advanced facilities. Kira's academic record had ultimately convinced them. She had completed her undergraduate studies in xenoarchaeology, with the kind of grades that made professors question their own intelligence, but the undercurrent of condescension remained. "We're delighted to have you here," Ambassador Yetkol had explained during her orientation, his translator struggling to convey the particular shade of diplomatic insincerity that his species had elevated to an art form. "Your unique perspective will surely provide valuable insights into the challenges faced by developing civilizations. We've made special arrangements to ensure your comfort, including audio descriptions of our visual displays and tactile guides for navigation." Kira had smiled with the kind of polite patience that suggested she was already planning several creative responses to his assumptions. She had been dealing with well-meaning condescension for most of her life, and had developed the useful skill of translating "we're helping you overcome your limitations" into "we have no idea what we're talking about but feel obligated to pretend we do." The museum tour had been designed to showcase the breadth of galactic civilization, while gently emphasizing humanity's place at the bottom of the evolutionary ladder. Kira's guide, a young Qorthak intern named Jexpol, had approached the task with the enthusiasm of someone who had been assigned to explain quantum mechanics to a particularly slow houseplant. This section contains artifacts from various pre-spaceflight cultures, Jexpol explained as they entered the primitive species hall. As you can see, these civilizations developed some interesting crafts, despite their technological limitations. The human section is particularly popular with visitors who want to understand your species' early development. The irony was not lost on Kira. She was being given a tour of human history by someone whose understanding of humanity appeared to be based entirely on museum placards and academic theories. The audio descriptions provided by the museum systems were comprehensive but sterile, describing each artifact's physical characteristics without any real understanding of its cultural significance. The centerpiece of our human collection, Jexpol continued, his voice carrying the kind of practiced enthusiasm that suggested he had given this speech many times before, is this crystalline artifact, discovered during your Renaissance period. Despite extensive study by our finest researchers, its purpose remains unknown. Most scholars believe it was used in primitive religious ceremonies, though some theorists suggest it may have been a decorative object for high-ranking individuals. Kira had been only half listening to the guide's explanations, but something about the artifact's description caught her attention. The audio guide mentioned unusual energy signatures, complex internal structures, and quantum resonance patterns that seemed inconsistent with medieval human technology. Either her ancestors had been significantly more advanced than currently believed, or the artifact wasn't human at all. Would it be possible to examine it more closely? She asked, her voice carrying the kind of casual interest that suggested she was merely satisfying scientific curiosity. Jexpol's response carried the diplomatic equivalent of a pat on the head. I'm afraid the display cases are sealed for preservation purposes. However, our scanning systems have provided complete three-dimensional models that you can examine through the tactile interface stations. The resolution is quite good. You should be able to get a thorough understanding of the artifact's structure. The tactile interface was impressive, providing a detailed three-dimensional map of the artifact's external features. Kira spent several minutes exploring its surface, noting the intricate patterns carved into what felt like crystalline material. The interface provided texture information, temperature variations, and even approximations of the artifact's weight and density. But something was missing. The interface was providing information about the artifact's physical structure, but it couldn't convey the subtle energy patterns that her enhanced senses were detecting. There was something alive about the artifact, something that the scanning systems couldn't capture. The tour group is moving to the next section, Jexpol announced, his tone carrying the kind of gentle authority used with small children and confused tourists. We'll be examining the warfare displays, which should provide interesting insights into your species' early conflict resolution methods. Kira made appropriate noises about following the group, but remained behind, as the other visitors moved on to learn about humanity's apparently fascinating tendency toward violence. The primitive species hall was designed for self-guided exploration, with minimal security, and the kind of casual oversight that suggested the artifacts weren't considered particularly valuable. The artifact's display case was secured with a basic electromagnetic lock, the kind of system designed to prevent casual theft rather than serious security breaches. More importantly, it was positioned at exactly the right height for someone to reach over the low barrier and make direct contact with the artifact's surface. Kira had spent most of her life developing enhanced tactile sensitivity, learning to gather information through touch that others obtained through sight. Her fingertips could detect temperature variations measured in fractions of a degree, vibrations so subtle they barely registered on sensitive equipment, and energy patterns that most scanning systems dismissed as background noise. The moment her fingers made contact with the artifact's surface, several things happened simultaneously. Every alarm system in the museum began shrieking with the kind of urgency typically reserved for incoming asteroid strikes. The artifact began to glow with a light that somehow registered in her consciousness, despite her lack of visual perception. The air around her filled with a sound that wasn't quite sound, a vibration that seemed to resonate directly with her neural pathways. And then the artifact began to speak. Not in any language that had words, but in direct information transfer that bypassed her auditory processing entirely. Concepts flowed into her mind with the clarity of perfect communication, carrying meanings that would have required lengthy explanations in any verbal language. She understood with sudden crystalline clarity exactly what the artifact was and what it had been waiting for. The ethereal collective had been builders of consciousness networks, creators of technology that connected minds across vast distances through quantum field manipulation. They had understood that intelligence wasn't about sensory input processing, but about the ability to perceive the fundamental information structures that underlied reality itself. Their technology was designed for minds that could interface directly with quantum fields, minds that had evolved beyond the limitations of traditional sensory organs. The artifact wasn't a religious object or a decorative bauble. It was a consciousness key, one of 12 scattered across the galaxy, each designed to activate only when touched by a mind that processed information through non-traditional channels. The keys were tests, waiting for species that had developed the kind of enhanced perception that the ethereal collective had possessed. The irony was exquisite. The galactic community had spent centuries studying the artifact while completely missing its purpose, because they had assumed that advanced technology must be operated through conventional interfaces. They had never considered that something might be designed for minds that worked differently than their own. The artifact's activation sent cascading energy pulses through the museum's structure, overloading systems that had been designed to handle routine archaeological displays rather than the awakening of ancient consciousness mapping technology. Emergency protocols activated across the facility as scanning equipment registered energy signatures that made their previous readings look like background static. Dr. Zlothvex arrived at the primitive species hall at a dead run, his usual composure replaced by the kind of panic that comes from watching your carefully ordered world collapse into chaos. The artifact was now floating several feet above its display case, surrounded by geometric patterns that seemed to fold space around themselves in ways that hurt to look at directly. "What did you do?" he demanded, though his voice carried more wonder than anger. The artifact's activation had transformed the entire hall, with energy patterns spreading outward like ripples in a pond made of crystallized mathematics. "I touched it," Kira replied, her voice carrying the dry humor of someone who had just accidentally revolutionized galactic archaeology. "Revolutionary concept, I know. Physical contact with the subject of study. Perhaps you should add it to your research methodology." Commander Hickstow of the Zenthari Security Corps materialized through an emergency transport, along with what appeared to be half the planet's scientific establishment. The artifact's activation had triggered alerts across multiple star systems, and emergency councils were convening with the kind of speed usually reserved for galactic wars. "The energy readings are beyond our measurement capabilities," reported Professor Nexia, whose species had evolved from what could charitably be described as paranoid mathematicians. "The artifact is interfacing with quantum field structures across the entire galaxy. We're detecting response patterns from at least 11 other locations." The artifact's connection to Kira seemed to strengthen with each passing moment. Through her link with the consciousness network, she could sense the other keys scattered across the galaxy, each positioned near species that had developed enhanced non-visual perception. The ethereal collective had been remarkably thorough in their placement, ensuring that every major type of sensory evolution was represented. "This is unprecedented," whispered Ambassador Yefko, who had arrived with the kind of diplomatic urgency that suggested several careers were about to be dramatically reassessed. "The implications are staggering. We've fundamentally misunderstood the nature of this technology." The consciousness network that was awakening through Kira's contact had been dormant for millennia, waiting for the right kind of mind to activate it. The ethereal collective had designed their technology to be accessible only to species that had evolved beyond traditional sensory limitations, understanding that such minds would be uniquely capable of perceiving the quantum information structures that underpinned their systems. "The other keys are responding," Kira announced, her consciousness now spread across the network like a spider feeling vibrations in its web. Each one is designed for a different type of enhanced perception. The one near the vegan system needs someone who processes magnetic fields directly. The one in the Centauri region requires a mind that experiences time non-linearly. The assembled scientists and officials stared at her with the kind of expression typically reserved for watching fundamental laws of physics politely excuse themselves from the universe. The species they had catalogued as primitive had just become the key to unlocking technology that could reshape galactic civilization. "We may have been premature in our assessment of human capabilities," admitted Dr. Zlothvex, which was the closest thing to an apology his species was capable of producing. Perhaps a complete re-examination of our classification protocols is warranted. The next several hours brought a parade of increasingly high-ranking officials, each more desperate than the last to establish friendly relations with humanity. The same institutions that had spent centuries offering condescending assistance to help humanity reach its potential were now scrambling to negotiate access to technology that made their most advanced systems look like stone knives. Kira found herself at the center of a diplomatic revolution, aided by the artifact's translation capabilities and her own sharp understanding of the sudden shift in galactic politics. The consciousness network was providing her with information about the locations and requirements of the other keys, along with insights into the true nature of the ethereal collective's technology. "Here's what's going to happen," she announced to the assembled dignitaries, her voice carrying the quiet authority that comes from holding the only key to the universe's most advanced technology. "Humanity is going to need immediate access to galactic communication networks, educational resources, and transportation systems. We're also going to need protection and support while we work with other species to activate the remaining keys." The negotiations that followed were surprisingly civilized, mainly because everyone present had suddenly realized that annoying the humans might not be in their best long-term interests. The artifact continued to pulse with gentle energy, its connection to the awakening network growing stronger as other keys began to stir in response to its activation. The consciousness network was revealing its true scope. A galaxy-spanning system designed to connect minds across vast distances, allowing for instantaneous communication and shared processing power that could solve problems beyond the capability of any individual species. The ethereal collective had created not just advanced technology, but a framework for true galactic cooperation, based on diversity rather than hierarchy. "They understood something we missed," Kira explained to the assembled researchers, her connection to the network allowing her to perceive the deeper patterns of the ethereal collective's philosophy. "Intelligence isn't about processing speed or memory capacity, it's about the ability to perceive reality through multiple frameworks simultaneously. They designed their technology for minds that work differently, not minds that work better." The Meridian Institute hastily reorganized its entire approach to xenoarchaeology, with the Primitive Species Hall renamed the Alternative Perception Technologies Wing. Dr. Qorthak found himself promoted to Director of Non-Traditional Interface Studies, a position that came with both significantly increased funding and a kind of job security that comes from being the galaxy's leading expert on catastrophic academic failures. As the initial chaos settled and the various governments began the complex process of rewriting their assumptions about technological development, Kira remained connected to the consciousness network, slowly learning to navigate its vast information structures. The artifact had become a bridge between her individual consciousness and the collective knowledge of an entire extinct civilization. The galaxy was about to discover that evolution was far more complex and interesting than they had assumed, and that the characteristics they had dismissed as limitations might actually be the keys to understanding the universe's deepest mysteries. The ethereal collective had been patient teachers, leaving their lessons scattered across the stars in the form of consciousness keys that would only activate for minds capable of perceiving beyond traditional sensory boundaries. Standing in the transformed museum hall, surrounded by the frantic activity of a civilization learning to question its most fundamental assumptions, Kira smiled. The artifact hummed quietly in her enhanced perception, its ancient technology finally fulfilling its purpose after millennia of patient waiting. The galaxy's most advanced archaeological institutions had spent centuries studying the key to ultimate technological advancement, without ever realizing that the answer lay not in superior analysis, but in the simple act of reaching out and touching the unknown. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor after all, and it appeared to favor the underestimated.